Hello, I am Dr. Weiss, and I am presenting some information on Wide Sargasso Sea by Gene Rise. This is my wrap-up PowerPoint. This is not my initial PowerPoint that introduced a little bit about Gene Rise's life and post-colonialism. You can find that video on my YouTube channel, Dr. Daniel Weiss. This is a wrap-up. What I'm going to do is explore some various areas, some various themes. These are not exclusive to one another, depending on what kind of argument that you might be making. But these are various areas that sort of demand further exploration. This is not an exhaustive list. This is a list that I hope facilitates additional thinking on this. I am going to be using the Norton Critical Edition from 1999, which is an excellent edition with some important essays, interesting and informative essays in the back. And when I reference a page number, that is the edition that I will be using. There are a number of very powerful symbols in this text, and I don't recall how many times I've read this novel before, maybe a dozen or so times, and for a variety of reasons, I have a hard time with this novel. Maybe it's overall depressive attitude that is represented in this novel primarily by Antoinette, but really by all of the characters. But you know, we see the interior world of Mr. Rochester, Antoinette's husband, that we see primarily in part two, but also in all three parts, some of the interior world, or a lot of the interior world of Antoinette. And we go through these kind of ruminations. Sometimes we're not sure if we're talking about a dream she's having, or reality, or her imagination. And then we encounter in the text some very powerful symbols. And in a way, the kinds of confusion at times that this novel creates, whether it's in terms of following the plot and trying to understand who's speaking or whatnot, we are suddenly grounded in a very powerful and impactful image. And I think there are a handful of powerful symbols in this text. One of them being the dead horse that we encounter very early on, that the dead horse is an indication that the Causeway family, that Annette's and Antoinette's family is in significant decline, that the horse was representative or symbolic of mobility, but also wealth, or the wealth that they used to have, and now the horse is dead. Another powerful symbol in the text is the parrot, and it's really a moment of pathos. It's really a pathetic moment that this parrot, whose wings had been clipped, is on fire and trying to fly away from the destruction of Calibre. I am on page 47. And I find this an incredibly powerful symbol. I believe that this is not the first time that this image is present in the novel, and it appears several times. I am towards the bottom of page 47. There were trailing pink flowers on the table, and the name echoed pleasantly in my head, Coralita, Coralita. The food, though too highly seasoned, was lighter and more appetizing than anything I had tasted in Jamaica. We drank champagne. A great many moths and beetles found their way into the room, flew into the candles, and fell dead on the tablecloth. Amélie swept them up with a crumb brush, uselessly. More moths and beetles came. And I find that this is a powerful symbol of futility. At the center of this novel is Antoinette, and perhaps this is symbolic of the futility she feels in her life, and ultimately, in whatever direction she turns to, there is no resolution. There's a brick wall there, so to speak, and it just sort of happens over and over and over again, like the insects that are attracted to light and ultimately only find death. And of course, the candle being a flame, the novel is framed in fire. The novel starts with the destruction of Calibre, and the novel ends with Antoinette burning down the home that she is in England. So very powerful. There are various points of view in this text, and the various points of view structure the novel. There are three parts of this of the novel. Part 1 and 3 is from Antoinette's point of view, and part 2 is primarily from Mr. Rochester's point of view, although there are some moments of Antoinette's point of view in that. The purpose of this, and one of the sort of overarching purposes, perhaps, that Jean Rice has, is to give voice to Bertha, and we'll talk about Bertha in a little bit, but to give voice to Bertha, the woman who was locked away in Bronte's Jane Eyre, that she did not have a voice. And here in this novel, a kind of rewriting, giving an opportunity to Antoinette, who unfortunately is going to descend into a kind of madness by the end of this text, but to give her a voice. And even in the section that is primarily, in section 2, primarily Mr. Rochester, we hear from Antoinette's point of view. So even in Mr. Rochester's section, the text gives voice to Antoinette's story. What is also, I think, really quite interesting is that even though we are inside the head, if you will, of Mr. Rochester, I don't find him a particularly likable character. So, people act in a certain way, and we may say, "Oh, okay, I don't really like that person, but maybe inside they're a good person." I don't find Mr. Rochester very likable at all. In fact, not only through his actions, but even in his thinking, he just doesn't seem to be a very nice person. But why should he be different than anybody else, I suppose? We can think about this novel in terms of maturation. How far does the maturation get? Well, we see Antoinette in the beginning of the novel as a young girl, and by the time we get to the end of the novel, she is married. So there's a kind of maturation process that takes place here. We can think about the novel in terms of relationships and what kind of relationships exist in this novel. And this is not an exhaustive list. We have a relationship between a mother or a mother figure and the daughter, whether we're talking about Annette and Antoinette, and what are the consequences of Annette being absent for her daughter. There's a moment early on in the text where they're talking about Pierre, and Annette leaves Antoinette to go to Pierre, and that kind of sibling rivalry exists there very soon after Pierre is going to be killed in the fire. But I think it's more than that. I think it's that there's a kind of abandonment even while Annette is present for Antoinette. And then after the fire, Antoinette is abandoned, that Annette has to deal with her own mental challenges and is not able to care for Antoinette. What does that mean? What is the effect of that kind of relationship? Moreover, to think about the relationship between father or father figures and Antoinette. Does she get what she needs from Mr. Mason? And I think the answer to that is no. Does she get what she needs from Christophine as a mother figure? I think so, but perhaps it's not enough. And at a certain point, Christophine also leaves Antoinette. Nature versus civilization, or paradise versus hell. There are all sorts of moments in this text that are really quite beautiful. A lot of color, a lot of description of birds, description of trees, descriptions of flowers. And if we think of ourselves as a kind of wandering tourist, that wouldn't it be nice to go now to the Windward Islands in the Caribbean or to Jamaica? It would be beautiful. And what is it that we see? We would be amazed with the blue water. We would be amazed with the brilliant flowers and the orchids and the coralita and all of those sorts of things. But at the same time, there's also a kind of necrosis that is taking place. That this is a paradise that is not a viable living paradise, but one that has fallen. And this, the sort of symbolism of color, of nature, I think changes in different parts of the novel as well. For one, this may be what had attracted Mr. Mason and Mr. Rochester to the Caribbean in the first place. With nature, you have the opportunity for sugar production and having a plantation and other sorts of agricultural products. And at the same time, the things that, as we might be paying attention to as a wandering tourist, are not the sorts of things that the native Caribbean people would be interested in. What about social relations? What about their interactions? What about the symbolism of having these beautiful plants fall into decay? How does that relate to history? I think ultimately there is a misunderstanding of culture in this text. One that Mr. Mason is unable to overcome, which may then result in the burning down of Calibre. And there's a distance, a misunderstanding that Mr. Rochester cannot overcome as well. In this respect, I think Antoinette is caught between multiple cultures. She's not black, she's not native to the Caribbean, but she's also not English. And so I think in both ways, Mr. Rochester misunderstands her. I am on page 23, early in the text. This is an example, I believe, of Mr. Mason not understanding the culture, not understanding slave history. This is a period when the novel takes place when the black population had been emancipated, but perhaps the sorts of payments that the government had promised to former plantation owners had not taken place. The economy had collapsed, and there was a lot of anger and resentment. Emancipation, in many ways, was not enough, and the decline of the causeways was not enough. There was a palpable anger, a hatred towards white people or former slave masters in the Caribbean, and we see that here represented. That Mr. Mason, as being an outsider, misunderstands. On page 23, second paragraph, there is no reason to be alarmed, my stepfather was saying as I came in. A handful of drunken black people. He opened the door leading to the glacis and walked out. What is all this? He shouted. What do you want? A horrible noise swelled up, like animals howling. But worse. We heard stones falling onto the glacis. He was pale when he came in again, but he tried to smile as he shut and bolted the door. More of them than I thought, and in a nasty mood too. They will repent in the morning. Well, they don't repent in the morning. And in fact, they burn the house down. The parrot is killed, and Antoinette's brother Pierre dies because of the wounds he suffers because of the fire. The text here in the portion that I read also says, like animals howling. This is a description of the black people that are making some noise outside of the Calibre house, the Calibre estate, and they are dehumanized. This is the misunderstanding of white English culture and the black Caribbean culture, that they are animals, that they are less than, that they are called at various times lazy, and they are like children. So this is a misunderstanding of Caribbean culture. This is a misunderstanding of slave history. There is also a misunderstanding of language. At times, Mr. Rochester is irritated that some of the speaking that goes on around him is not in a language that he can understand. This is the classic sort of imperialist or classic colonialist stance. When the colonialist comes in to the land that he is going to colonize, he imprints his culture, including language, and this shifts the historical trajectory of that particular people. When various characters in this text speak in a language other than English, they are reasserting their former, reasserting their culture, reasserting their methods of communication in a way that not only that the colonialist doesn't understand, but in a voice that is theirs. This is a novel, as many of the novels we've looked at periodically here, this is a novel about violence. How are these very important sort of resentments and hatreds expressed? Are they solely expressed through language? Do people go on social media and put pressure to do something? No, none of that here is existing. Ultimately, people get angry, they are resentful, they are bitter, and it is expressed through violence. It is expressed in the early part of the text with the burning down of Calibre. It is expressed with after the burning down, immediately following the burning down of Calibre, when Antoinette sees her friend Tia, and they had an argument, they had a disagreement earlier on, and some harsh words were exchanged. But Antoinette sees Tia, her childhood friend, Antoinette being white, Tia being black. But as children, yeah, they were aware of that, but ultimately Antoinette loved Tia. I mean, Tia was a playfellow, a friend. And when Antoinette goes or approaches Tia, Tia throws a stone at her face and cuts her, and she bleeds. And Tia is crying, and her mother ushers her away. And Antoinette is crying and has to recover from an injury which could have done some significant damage. We have the poisoning of Mr. Rochester. All throughout this text, we have these moments of violence that are sometimes foretold, and sometimes we can see them coming, and at other times they creep out and then surprise us. So again, the structure of the novel also relates to the violence in the text, in that the novel begins with a fire that people die in, and or Pierre dies in, and the parrot, and the end of the novel, which bookends the text with another fire. Antoinette dies here as well. So there's a violence against self, there's a violence against others, and these are reactions against not individual moments in the text, but a history of slights, a history of betrayals, a history of dehumanization of different cultures as they clash together and have a difficulty in reconciling in any sort of way. So for us to consider violence in this text. Throughout this novel, Antoinette turns to various people or places in order, these places being familiar to her, to help her during a particularly traumatic, difficult moment. And religion is one of those areas that she turns to. I mean, isn't religion used well, it's used in many ways, but it's used to as a strategy to help people cope with certain things. When people don't understand something, they turn to a sacred text to try to understand the world, to try to understand their position in the world, to try to understand trauma or suffering. And for Antoinette, that does not work. I'm on page 36, a few paragraphs from the bottom. While I am drinking it, I remember that after my mother's funeral, very early in the morning, almost as early as this, we went home to drink chocolate and eat cakes. She died last year. No one told me how, and I didn't ask. Mr. Mason was there, and Christophine, no one else. Christophine cried bitterly, but I could not. I prayed, but the words fell to the ground, meaning nothing. That particular paragraph, I think, is really pregnant with a lot of different meaning. For one, Antoinette, at least at the manifest level or outwardly, in her exterior position, is indifferent to the death of her mother. And I think that the death of her mother, at least to her interior world, to her unconscious, has a much greater effect. The fact that Antoinette doesn't feel is extremely problematic. In fact, over and over again in this novel, Antoinette says if she doesn't think about it or if she pushes it away, perhaps it won't be. And we know that that is not the best strategy for understanding emotional distress. So we turn to religion. And she prayed, but the words meant nothing to her. So religion is an avenue that she turns to and has nothing. Um, Voodoo, zombies in this text. And there's a particular moment in the text um, where both within the text, the obia or zombies are discussed, and a lengthy footnote about zombies. And I find this to be a particularly interesting moment. One, that the text felt it important to discuss what a zombie is, and then the editors of the version of this version, giving us more information about zombies. That a zombie is a kind of is a person that is dead but also alive. And I think importantly that this becomes another symbol for Antoinette. What is also important about this is just not a Christian society. This is an amalgamation of different religions. There is a Christianity here that exists, but it is combined with various African religions. From the Middle Passage, when Africans were bought and brought over to the Caribbean and into South America, they brought a variety of different languages with them and a variety of different belief systems. And these were amalgamated together along with Christianity, and voodoo is a kind of product of that, a product of amalgamation, but also from earlier belief systems brought over from Africa and developed specifically in various regions of the Caribbean or in South America. I said earlier that one of the difficulties I have with this novel is because it's a sad novel. I mean, as a consumer, as a reader, I read this novel and it is sad. There is no place that Antoinette gets to sort of recoup the delight that there should be, at least in moments in life. On page 55, about 6 lines down from the top, Antoinette says, "I am not used to happiness," she said. "It makes me afraid." And I think that this is a powerful statement because in the sort of construction of individual psychology, the mind forms a schema or a structure, a prism with which to understand the world. And for somebody who's better adjusted, they can sort of gauge a particular moment on its own merits. Well, I'm not having the greatest day. This kind of stinks. Okay, tomorrow will be better. Okay, well, tomorrow I got to do this and I saw a friend, or I had a good experience. And so this makes that moment good. And in that way, life is good. But a person who frames the world in sadness, it's very difficult to break that framework because the sadness is a prism with which that individual looks at all things in the world. And even when Antoinette has a moment that might be deemed as happy or some variation of happiness, the framework kicks in, the prism kicks in, and even that moment or experience of happiness becomes subjacent to the framework and cannot be experienced as happiness because, as Antoinette says here, happiness frightens her. Further, what does that mean? That means, I think, the constant betrayals, the constant letdowns, the despair, both individually within her family and within community, have set up this framework. And in her past, when there might have been moments that have made her happy, there were more moments that traumatized her, that were sad. And so a person who says, well, I'm afraid of happiness, is a person who's afraid of that kind of betrayal. And so the entire framework, the entire perception of life is one of sadness. And that, I think, makes the novel difficult to consume. Um, a lot of things about dreams, and I think that this novel is ripe to think about in terms of psychoanalysis, in terms of psychology. When we move into the dream world, what does that mean? Everything is a symbol, everything can be unpacked. Is it a dream that helps protect sleep? Is it a dream that is interrupted? Then it might not be a dream at all. Are the perceptions of those dreams that are experienced in this novel, are they accurate? Does Antoinette recognize the importance of the dream, or are there different levels, sublimated levels, things that are different than, let's say, a manifest content, what Freud would call the latent content? Is there displacement and condensing of various objects into other things? Um, there's also, I think, moments in this text where we're not entirely certain where, or if, I should say, that Antoinette is dreaming or imagining things, or as we move towards the end of the novel, if in fact reality is just simply collapsing. I am on page 111. At the bottom of page 110, "Your red dress," she said and laughed. But I looked at the dress on the floor, and it was as if the fire had spread across the room. It was beautiful, and it reminded me of something I must do. I will remember, I thought. I will remember quite soon now. Then there is a break. That was the third time I had my dream, and it ended. I know now that the flight of steps leads to this room where I lie watching the woman asleep with her head on her arms. And my reaction, and perhaps yours too, is what is going on? That the red is beautiful, and clearly, I think, it clearly refers to fire, not not something beautiful. I mean, I think that this is paradoxical. And then we have the break between one section and another, and what is going on in that break. And then she refers to a dream, and I think that this sort of fusion or confusion of imagination, dreaming, and reality is indicative of Antoinette's fractured state. When we talk about violence, when we talk about mental distress, we can certainly talk about trauma, certainly in terms of the fire. And again, returning to this idea of the familiar in terms of trauma, one of the ways with which children become socialized in a healthy way is they gain a certain amount of confidence in the world around them. This is provided by a stable environment, hopefully a stable mother or mother figure, a stable father or a father figure. And one of the things that trauma does is it comes out of nowhere. It undermines the familiarity and the confidence that a young child might have, and this can become, this is most often very traumatic. Depending on the trauma itself and how powerful it is, and depending on the support system that the child has, then the child can overcome these traumatic moments and once again regain self-confidence and a familiarity and trust of the world around him or her. That does not happen with Antoinette. I mean, think about the fire as such a traumatic moment and one's brother being essentially burned alive. Does Antoinette get the kind of support that she might need to overcome or reconcile or understand this traumatic experience? The answer to that, I think, is no. And this relates then to the sadness of the novel, I think, because this creates despair or depression or any other term or version of that term might be appropriate. Ultimately, I think this novel then is one of the sort of big thematic areas is about identity. This is identity and how it is constructed, or in many ways, how it is not constructed, or how it is constructed in a very fractured way. Both individually, Antoinette as a young woman and her understanding of self, this is fractured. Identity is fractured and deconstructed in this novel because of the colonial state, the sort of push and pull of various historical forces of community and of Antoinette's family. And I want to look at a couple of moments here pertaining to identity. I am on page 81. And this has to do with Rochester calling Antoinette Bertha. And as I've discussed in other lectures, a person's name is important to them, even if it's, let's say, a common name. A common name doesn't matter. It's your name, and it becomes a part of your identity. And if someone were to say, hey, Dave, your name is now Joe, or vice versa, then you're like, no, that's not my name. That's not who I am. And this happens here in this novel as well. On page 81, after a long time, I heard her say, as if she was talking to herself, I have said all I want to say. I have tried to make you understand, but nothing has changed. She laughed. Don't laugh like that, Bertha. My name is not Bertha. Why do you call me Bertha? Because it is a name I'm particularly fond of. I think of you as Bertha. It doesn't matter, she said. Now, Antoinette's reaction about how it doesn't matter is a way that Antoinette has reacted to distressing moments all throughout this text. But Rochester's renaming of Antoinette as Bertha is really, I would use the term violent. It's a violent moment pertaining to the restructuring or continued destruction of Antoinette's identity. If we look on page, let me see here. If we look on page 88, that identity is not only tied to familial relations, it's not only tied to historical relations, it's tied to place. At the bottom of page 88, if my father, my real father, was alive, you wouldn't come back here in a hurry after he'd finished with you. If he was alive. And again, this sort of indicates the role of parents and what she's saying here at this moment, that if her father was alive, he would protect me. But he can't do that. Do you know what you've done to me? It's not the girl, but I love this place, and you have made it into a place I hate. I used to think that if everything else went out of my life, I would still have this, and now you have spoiled it. This is Antoinette telling Rochester that he has ruined a place that helped give her foundation to her understanding of self. Okay, this was just a brief overview on some of my thoughts on why Sargasso Sea. Thank you.